As I mentioned before, VAWA claims don't always have to be physical in nature. In other words, you might be eligible for a green card through VAWA if you were the victim of extreme psychological abuse. Now, I have spoken a lot about VAWA fraud, but I wanted to give you some real life examples of when USCIS has approved VAWA self-petitions based on extreme psychological abuse. Again, one of the main benefits of VAWA is not having to leave the United States and be eligible for adjustment of status in the U.S., despite, for example, your spouse not being willing to petition for you, or even being divorced if you file within 2 years of the divorce. So here are some examples of real VAWA cases that USCIS has previously found credible and sufficient to meet the extreme cruelty standard. First is gaslighting and threats of deportation. In this case, a U.S. citizen husband regularly called his immigrant wife illegal, threatened to call ICE on her or call immigration on her if she disagreed with him. He repeatedly told her that if she didn't obey, she would be in Mexico by morning. He mocked her accent. He called her useless and stupid. He hid her passport and immigration papers and used them to control her movements. And he would initiate and then withdraw I-130 petitions to keep her unstable. And USCIS accepted this as a campaign of control and fear-based emotional abuse. Second, forced isolation and verbal domination. In this case, a U.S. citizen wife forced her immigrant husband to quit his job. She told him, "I didn't marry you so you could leave the house." She cut off his access to friends, family, his church, and monitored all his phone calls and texts. She routinely told him he was a bad father and threatened to take the children away. This threat of threatening to take the children away or calling immigration on him if he pursued custody in a divorce, that's a common fact pattern that you might see in a VAWA. She controlled all money. She essentially gave him an allowance. Psychological reports showed anxiety, depression, and even suicidal ideation. And this was accepted as extreme cruelty, rooted in power and coercion. 3, public humiliation and emotional degradation. In this case, a permanent resident husband took his wife to parties and introduced her as his maid or my little immigrant. He joked with friends about how she's only here for the green card, while simultaneously refusing to file a petition for her. He told her, "You're lucky I even married you, and you'll be deported once I get tired of you." Repeatedly threatened to have her children taken away because you're not a citizen. The wife was diagnosed with PTSD and panic attacks, and USCIS found that repeated humiliation tied to immigration status and threat of family separation met the standard for extreme cruelty. 4, religious and cultural coercion. In this case, a U.S. citizen husband used religious authority to control his immigrant wife, quoting scripture to justify that submission. He told her that divorce would send her to hell and that God doesn't care about papers. He forced her to give up her own cultural clothing and to stop speaking her native language. He would make her confess her sins if she disagreed with him. He refused to allow her to see a doctor for postpartum depression, claiming it was in her head. This was documented through clergy statements and therapist letters of spiritual and psychological abuse. And 5, immigrant husbands, jealousy and threats. In this case, a permanent resident husband constantly accused his wife of cheating, installed cameras in the home. Sorry, not an immigrant husband, U.S. citizen, green card husband's jealousy and threats. He would go through her phone. He would threaten to hurt himself or her if she left him. She was trapped in the cycle of "I love you one day and then you'll pay if you leave me the next." He again told her she would lose her children to CPS if she ever called the police. Threatened to lie to USCIS and say she married him for papers, and USCIS found this as manipulative psychological abuse, creating extreme fear and dependency. So those are some fact patterns that were accepted. There was a lack of physical abuse, right? But they were accepted to meet the threshold of extreme psychological abuse for, getting a VAWA approval and later eligibility for adjustment of status. So I hope that these examples help.